Good evening, everybody. Hello and welcome to another broadcast from the Rogues Shanty Chorus featuring our wonderful local historian, Ivan Bunn. We're going to say hello to Ivan in just a minute, but first of all, I'm going to just welcome everybody that's already commented on our post this evening and say hello to Chris Collins. She says good evening all, and hello to Sude. She says exactly the same. We also have Jerry Poole and Karen Harris and Linda Boyce. They're all saying hello. They're all looking forward to another interesting talk on the history of Lowestoft, and particularly, I believe, this evening, a continuation of the history of Kirkley, which, for those that don't know, is a parish of Lowestoft. And I'm going to move aside immediately and welcome in properly Ivan Bunn. He's a local legend of Lowestoft, and he's our resident historian for today. Ivan, how are you?
I'm fine, thanks, Paul. How are you? Welcome, everybody.
Not too bad at all. Now, for those... Hello?
Yeah, go on, Paul.
I'm just going to say, don't worry if you're worried about Stephen. He's in the background. He's still... he's the Wizard of Oz today. He's the man behind the curtain, making sure everything goes to plan. So he's on board. Don't worry. He's not fallen foul of anything sinister like Corona or a younger brother's evil intentions. He's still there and still healthy. So, Ivan, what have you got in store for us today?
Right, this evening, just to correct you slightly there, Paul, this is actually not the second half. This is the start of the presentation. It's quite a long one. What I intend to do, we've sort of figured a lot on witches and witchcraft trials of the Lowestoft witches, the early history of Lowestoft. I've had a fair number of requests from different people. Could I do something about South Lowestoft? So the presentation I've got is, in actual fact, the history, not so much of South Lowestoft. I was born and raised in Kirkley, and to me, South Lowestoft has always been Kirkley. So what I'm going to do tonight is, hopefully, all things being equal, I'll put my tea down, sitting here nursing a mug of tea. What I intend to do tonight is to do a history of the parish of Kirkley, how it grew over the years from being a tiny non-entity of a parish to a thriving holiday resort and town. That's what I'm going to do. Those of you who have watched my earlier presentations, we've had this kind of hiccup in the middle where we have to move my camera around and point it at the screen of my laptop and then transmit the pictures from the laptop screen. We've gone a little bit more high tech now, mostly thanks to Stephen. So what we can do now, we can project, we don't have to use my laptop anymore. You'll see the slides direct on the screen. They should be much sharper and much clearer, hopefully. Both I know Stephen have, and certainly I have, put a lot of time into getting this a little bit better, and if I dare say, a little bit more professional looking as well. So it's going to be interesting because this is the first time we've actually tried it live. So I hope you'll bear with us. I think we've got it down pretty tight now. During the slideshow, every so often I've made a lot of the slides automatic, but some of them I can't do for various technical reasons. So every so often throughout the talk, you might hear me mutter the word next. That's a cue to Stephen to press the key to move on to the next slide. Hopefully we've kept that down to a minimum. I think Kirkley is kind of neglected. It's been subsumed by the greater Lowestoft. And so this is based on a talk that I did some years ago for the Kirkley Business Association. And I actually call it putting Kirkley back on the map. So we're going to look at Kirkley as a separate parish ecclesiastically, which it always has been, even when it became part of the old borough of Lowestoft. But it's also always since Saxon times been a separate parish. So I'm going to start right back basically in Saxon times. There's not much known. Go through the Domesday Book, but then very quickly come forward to the late 18th century, where the records of the story really start. So that's my objective tonight. I'm not quite certain how long this presentation is going to last. We'll kick off in about 10 minutes at the most. If I see that we're running out of time and we've still got plenty of slides left, I'll do the second half next Monday. I'm just hoping, and fingers crossed, that I can get through everything tonight. Fortunately, I've set a lot of the slides timings so that they will change, and I have to go on to the next subject, so I can't sit and burble as I have a habit of doing sometimes. So anyway, we'll see how it works out. I'm sure, I know I would, and I'm sure Stephen would as well, about the format that we're going to do tonight. If you've got any comments, good or bad or indifferent even, bang them up. We can always read them through afterwards. As you know, these presentations are saved, so you can do them retrospectively. So, as I said, if you've got any comments about anything about what we're doing, I have to say I'm really pleased by the lovely positive comments that we're getting all the time. I was a bit disappointed that we couldn't do one last week, but that was circumstances beyond anyone's control. But here we are, up and running, and I'll start whenever we feel we've got an audience that are waiting to receive these historical facts.
Well, we do have a few people out there waiting for it. I think we'll just hold on for a couple of minutes, if you don't mind, Ivan. But there's certainly an eagerness out there. One eagerness point of which is the Drapers. Jackie Draper says, "Evening all from the Drapers," and having a little chat with Linda Boyce. That's very nice. And a very good evening to Jackie, and of course to Barry. Lovely to see you joining in. I'm just gonna while Ivan fixes with Stephen what needs doing backstage, I'm just going to mention a little bit about how we find ourselves here tonight. We ask Ivan to tell us all a little bit more about Lowestoft and the surrounding areas of Lowestoft. He is an absolute mine of information for the local area, and a fascinating listen as well. And anybody that's seen any of our previous broadcasts with Ivan will know just exactly how engaging he is, and if, as he said, if this is a longer broadcast than you've got time for, this is going to be available, as all of our broadcasts are. It's available to watch retrospectively on our Facebook page. Also, we are streaming tonight via YouTube. So if you find Facebook a little bit slow, or you've got friends or family that don't have access to Facebook, you can ask them to join in the fun and watch via YouTube instead. And we would love, as Ivan said, we would love to receive your comments. Any kind of comments you like, as long as they're related to tonight's broadcast. We would love to receive them. It might be things you think are going well, anything that's perhaps been problematic with technology, because that can happen. But especially any comments you have on the subject material that Ivan's going to be chatting about. And I'm just going to say, Jerry Paul says, Ivan equals national treasure, not just a local treasure, but a national treasure. And I don't think anybody would disagree with you from this end.
Huh. Jerry, you know how to make somebody feel very embarrassed, don't you? Thank you for that, Jerry.
Okay. Well, if you're ready, Ivan, then I think we'd be in good order to start the proceedings for tonight.
Yeah, just one more word of explanation to our audience. I've only got a tiny little iPad thing here, so the screen is very small and it's a fair way away from me. So what I've done, you won't see it because it's just off to my left here. I've got my laptop, and I'm going to sync what you're seeing. I've got my sync top. Sync my laptop. I'm going to sync my laptop with the screens that you see, so that if you see me occasionally glancing over to my left, That's because I'm looking at my screen, which is much bigger and much clearer to me, because my eyes ain't what they were. So it's not because I'm losing interest, it's simply because I've got one or two, my memory is not what it used to be. So sitting on the floor down here, I've got some notes as well. So if I bend down occasionally just to remind myself a date or some statistics, bear with me, please. Okay, having said that, if we're all ready, I'm as ready as I'll ever be. As they say, on with the show.
Let's go for it.
Right, the map you'll see that comes up first. These are just my opening credits. Looking back at Kirkley, and we are basically, or I am hopefully putting Kirkley back on the map. The first map that you'll see, this is a modern map of Kirkley. I want to go back to Anglo-Saxon times and see what would have been here when the water table was much higher. And here, hopefully, you'll see bleeding through is a map drawn up by the Environmental Agency showing the areas that would flood should we go back to thousands of years ago. And my map is based on that. The green area that you can see is the area of land with above the 50-meter contour line, and in the center of the circle is the church. The red line all the way around is the parish boundary. Now, the earliest reference to Kirkley is Kirkley in 1086 in the Domesday Book, Kirkley again in 1200, Kirkley, all the different spellings in 1524, and it's probably from the Old English or Old Scandinavian kirke, meaning a church, and ley, a glade or clearing. So it's a glade or clearing in which stands the church. And you'll see there there's an arrow pointing to a little slither of land. Now, somewhere in this area, we don't know exactly where, was a little tiny community of 5 acres called Herns, which is Old English for a spit or tongue of land. It's spelt like horn. And over there today, we still have Horn Hill. And that's probably where this community was, this tiny little community was situated. So Horn Hill might be, and I'm only saying might, there's no evidence of that, Horn Hill might and actually be back, be identified of this place called Hernus, which is the spit or tongue of land. And you can see there is definitely, even with the water levels, the height that they are on this overlay map here, you can see that we still get this tongue of land called Horn Hill. The Domesday Book, 1086, tells us there were 2 other settlements in Kirkley. One was called Wymundhala, which is a personal name of someone called Wigmund or Wigmund, and Hal, meaning a secluded place or nook. The other community, Bectuna, which is the Old English beck or stream, and a tun, which is a homestead or village. That's obviously somewhere close to the stream, Kirkley Stream, the running waters that are still there to a certain extent today. I'll come back to the running waters much later in this talk. So really, that's about all we know from the Domesday Book, using the usual formula to calculate the size of the population based on what we know. Kirkley had 175 acres of land. That's not the whole parish, that's just land that was being ploughed, that was land, that was arable land. There were 28 freemen living here, 3 plough teams. A plough team is usually 8 oxen, and using the formula to calculate a population based on those scant figures, there's probably a population of approximately 150 men, women, and children. Remember that 150 men, women, and children in 1086, if you can, because much further through here, I've got to mention it again as a comparison. So that, in a nutshell, and very much in a nutshell, is Kirkley, the high piece of 50 metre plus land with the church sitting on the edge, the low-lying and marshy land around it, and the ancient parish boundary and 2 communities. So if we move on to the next slide, next.
In the meantime, Ivan, could I just ask a brief question?
Of course, yeah.
I was just wondering, you mentioned about the different spellings of Kirkley, and I wondered if there was any particular reason for that, or if it was just administrative errors.
But when you go back to 1086, the Domesday Book itself lists it, kind of Latinizes it, and there is no standardized spelling whatsoever.
Right.
And this applies right the way down. Much later, we don't quite know, I've never been able to figure out why, the town Kirkley becomes known as Kirtley, Kirtley.
Right.
It's written Kirkley or Kirtley. So, you know, I can't give you an answer to that. It's just, I think, just the idiosyncrasies, is that the word? Anyway, of the spelling of the time, when a lot of the stuff was spelt phonetically. And of course, quite often, we know from Shakespeare that some of the letters of the alphabet in a word would have a different inflection to what they have today.
Yeah.
So it's all a bit open, but certainly the root of the two of the title, the clearing in which stands a church, is accepted as fact.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, absolutely. So okay. I guess it's basically the discrepancies of something that's made of 2 languages from, you know, Latin and Anglo-Saxon and
Scandinavian and what have you. Again, an element there. I mean, Lowestoft is a per-Scandinavian settlement. All of the elements in the name Lowestoft are Scandinavian. Okay, the Kirkley is different. There's a mixture between Anglo-Saxon and Scandinavian words. So there's a possibility that there were the incomers, the Scandinavians, the Vikings, if you want, in actual fact, did intermix with the local families, the Anglo-Saxons, and hopefully lived in harmony. Again, when we go further through, the Vikings will actually feature again in some of the stories about Kirkley much later on, but we'll come to them later. So if we go back to the screen, because I'm sure you'd rather look at that than me. There's the screen. So the earliest map, the earliest drawing that I found is this one. The originals in the British Library. It dates from the year 1580, and it's a panorama of the coast from Pakefield all the way through to Galston. I've just taken the Lowestoft bit, and if you look at the top left-hand corner of that map, you can see 2 churches have been drawn. One says Pakefield and one says Kirkley, spelled K-Y-R-C-L-E-Y. Interestingly enough, below the cliff there, it says Pakefield and Kirkley Deans. We've got Lowestoft Deans. Unfortunately, you can't quite see the word Deans because I cropped it off. But so there is possibly in 1580, there was a lot more dry land extending out into the sea, forming Deans, not so extensive as Lowestoft, but certainly enough for this cartographer who drew this stylized little plan, if you like, this little map. He decided that they could be described as Deans, meaning flat, low-lying, open ground. I suppose if you go down to Pakefield today, or even below the cliffs at Kirkley, looks like the way the beach is built up, the Deans are actually coming back, especially at Pakefield. So if we have the next slide, please. Okay, this map that you see, this is much later. This is Hodgkinson's map of Suffolk, dated 1783. Here's an enlargement from it. So again, I'm sure it's pretty self-explanatory. Just below the top of the map, you can see the word Lothing. You can't see the word lake because it's cropped off. And you can see Kirkley, and you can see a huge area known as Kirkley Heath. At least a third of Kirkley, right up until the early 1800s, was still unenclosed open heathland and common land. So you've got Kirkley Heath. I don't think Hodgkinson, when he drew this map, spoke to enough local people. Kirkley Heath should be, the word should be moved much closer to the sea, which is on the right-hand side, and that area marked as Kirkley Heath is actually in the parish of Carlton Colville that adjoins Kirkley to the west, and it was known as East Heath. But that's a pedant really. But you can see there's a tremendous lot of heathland, and much of it would probably be very boggy, more or less fen land. And right down the bottom of the map, you can see we come to Pakefield. Again, later on, when we get round to it, there'll be a little bit more to be said about the relationship between Kirkley and Pakefield. So we move on again to the next slide. So this is my map that I drew, Kirkley in 1800, as accurate as I can make it. The green area is all open common heathland. There are no enclosed fields, as you can see. And the salient points that are coming up on the screen now, I hope, to the north of the parish, we've got this long inlet of water known as Kirkley Ham. That's fed by back in the day, quite a broad, fast-flowing stream, or even a small river, the Kirkley stream. And right down at the bottom, just where Stradbroke Road is today, there was an area called the Black Heath. The Black Heath is quite interesting because that's a terminology that is often used back in the day to denote somewhere where there's been a fire or fighting. It's very close to the Anglo-Saxon village that stood on where Bloodmore is today. If you're interested in the Anglo-Saxon village, which is actually in Kirkley, there's a wonderful website. I can't give you the web address, but Google it and you'll soon find it. A very extensive village there, and there is a tradition that the Vikings. There was a time, if you remember the earlier map, when you see in this map by now, Lake Lothing has no connection to the sea pre-1800, and it will be another 30 years before, at least before, there is a cut made through to the sea into Lake Lothing. But so there would have been a long, very broad, shallow river all the way from the sea into from what's Kirkley Ham, that long arm of water, all the way down, right the way through down into Carlton Colville. And there's a legend, if you like. Well, it is a legend. My grandmother was bred in Kirkley, as were her ancestors, and she told me many years ago, when I was quite young, that, excuse me, just to drink the water there, that there was a tradition in Kirkley that at some time the Vikings had sailed their longships from the sea into Lake Lothing, through Kirkley Ham, down what's now Kirkley Stream, this broad water, and attacked a settlement somewhere round by the Black Heath. And the Black Heath, it might well be the site of where this incursion took place. There is absolutely no evidence whatsoever of this, but certainly it was a tradition that was passed down certainly through my grandmother's family. And as a bit of an aside, I was about 9 or 10 when she told me this story, and I actually thought she could remember the Vikings coming down the running waters and attacking a community down by the Black Heath. So that's the that's the interesting history of the Black Heath. And of course, we still have Blackheath Road. We still got, well, I grew up as a kid playing Blackheath Woods, as we called them. So that name lives on. Blackheath was, in actual fact, a little bit of unenclosed common land as well. As you see on the map, it's green. So there we have them, Kirkley Ham, Kirkley Stream, and Kirkley Bridge, because Kirkley Bridge was the only way westward out of Kirkley. Very important road, and Carlton Road was one of the main highways out of Kirkley at this time, and possibly gone back for many hundreds of years. It was no good going south if you wanted to get anywhere important. The roads would take you to Southwold and nowhere else. If you wanted to get inland and travel south, you had to go out over Kirkley Bridge, up the road that's now known as Kirkley Run, pick up modern Beccles Road, and make your way through Beccles and out that way. There is no way out south. So Kirkley Bridge is a very important bridge. And you can see as well, although I put it on for a reference point, you can see the windmill towards the top right-hand corner of the parish became known as Cleveland's Mill. It wasn't actually there in pre-1800. It wasn't built, as I'm pretty certain, around about 1829. I think that's the date. But I put that on there as well because there's the road leading to the mill is present-day Mill Road. So again, hopefully that will give you some references. Talking of references, what's left, or what can we see today in Kirkley that predates the year 1800? The answer to that is not a lot. So if we go to the next slide, please. We'll have a look at what was there in a moment. Here's a Kirkley Ham. This is about etching of about 1790. We're on the north shore of Lake Lothing, looking due south into Kirkley Ham. And there you can see perched just left of centre is Kirkley Church. In front of that is the old farm that was there for hundreds of years. That's roughly, if you're familiar with Kirkley, that's roughly where the Salvation Army Hall now stands today. And if you look behind the yacht sailing on the on Lake Lothing there, you can see a little cluster of buildings. That's where present-day Kirkley Street is, leading you through to Kirkley Fen. So this is and those buildings on the left there was a small enclosed piece of common land there, possibly a little farm or even a stave, but all of the land basically between those buildings on the extreme left, going right the way through almost to the farm below the church, is all open common land and wasteland. All of the land on the right-hand side of the Ham, including some of it on the Ham itself, is all again wasteland, very damp, wet, boggy land, as it was when I grew up in Kirkley myself. Most of it has been drained now. Ham is an Anglo-Saxon word which means an inlet of water, sluggish, brackish, fairly shallow water. So that's Kirkley Ham looking south. If we go on to the next slide and come much further forward, this is about 1780, 1790, we come to the next slide. This is about 1880. We're now standing on Waveney Drive. I'll give you a better clue where we are in a moment. Looking north towards Lake Lothing. This is low tide. It's a splendid picture. I love this photograph. This is low tide. When the tide is in, this whole area is one sheet of water. That's the northern part of Kirkley Ham. And you can still see it today. If you go to the next slide, that's the last remains of Kirkley Ham today. That's the very sanitized piece of that huge inlet of water. Now, the Kirkley stream, as we'll see in a moment, does in fact flow today, and it still flows into Kirkley Ham. It's now been piped underground, but if you there's a nice walkway around Asda beside the Ham. If you just come off Horn Hill, Waveney Drive, walk up that little walkway that we can see in front of Asda there, and look back down into the bottom right-hand corner of this picture, you'll see quite a large culvert where the stream still feeds into the Ham itself. Obviously, I think this was all built to stop the Vikings sailing their longships up there again. That might be a different story. The Ham was actually bridged and there's the plaque that unfortunately has disappeared when they laid these new roads out. It was in the wall there. 1894, they actually bridged the Ham itself, so you could get from across the Ham without having to go through rickety footbridges and up to your knees in muddy water. That was built actually by the McConaughey brothers, who in the 1890s had a huge food factory roughly where the site of Asda is today. So that's Kirkley Ham. And if we move on to the next slide. So of course, Kirkley Fen Park as it is today. This is really, it's not actually part of the Ham, but it's the area that's been flooded for generations and then converted into a park into the 1920s. We'll come back to that much later. And so this is possibly what part of the Ham would have looked back had you gone back there 500 years. And of course, to the north of Kirkley Fen, there's still quite a lot of reedy, boggy ground to be seen. Certainly when I grew up in Kirkley in the 1950s, early 60s, whole of the area to the north of Fen Park was still pretty untenable. It was very boggy, very wet, full of reeds, leading you right the way through almost to Horn Hill. If we move on to my next picture. So here's a photograph taken before they built Tom Crisp Way. And so we're looking north. Sorry, are we looking north? So I've just got to get my bearings now. Yes, we are looking north. We're looking north, not far from Kirkley Bridge. If you could climb into the field where the horse is, walk through the buildings there, you'd be out on Carlton Road. That's where the riding stables are today. So this is Kirkley Stream. My grandmother always referred to Kirkley Stream as the running waters, as did many people, because there's quite a copious flow of water there, or Kirkley Run. That's where the road Kirkley Run gets its name from. It's a run of water going through Kirkley. It's Kirkley Run. Tom Crisp Way, of course, is diverted it, piped it underground in places, But if we go to the next slide, we can see this is a photograph that I took a couple of years ago. The running waters are still running, albeit somewhat sluggishly. I don't know what the Vikings would think if they could see it today. And of course, that went down to Kirkley Bridge. Again, the original narrow bridge that took you into Kirkley Run disappeared when they laid out Tom Crisp Way and changed the whole road system there. So basically, if you come here in medieval times, you come down present-day Kirkley Run, the road of that name, cross Kirkley Bridge, went straight ahead. You're heading towards the Old Fighting Cocks Public House onto Carlton Road, which would then take you through into Kirkley itself. So Kirkley Bridge, again, was a very important way out of Kirkley if you wanted to go to Norwich, or you want to go to Beccles, you wanted to travel south to Halesworth, you still had to come over Kirkley Bridge. Perhaps one of these talks, I don't know how long they'll last, if I can get some of the old maps out, I can show you how the road system was in the 18th century in this area, which is a lot different to the road system that we know today. So we'll move on. So still in pre-1800 Kirkley, what buildings are there today that predate 1800? So first of all, just put one or two way markers on here, if you like, just so you can see where we are. There's Mill Road. There's Carlton Road. There's St. Peter's Church, now St. Peter and St. John. There's Pakefield Road. There's Pakefield Street. There's Kirkley Run. And there's Long Road. And of course, at the top is Lake Lothing. And last but by no means least, here's this road that leads you out onto the common, known as Kirkley Street. The only buildings that I've been able to identify as being earlier than 1800 are the old farmhouse on Kirkley Street, another farmhouse that still stands today, as does the one in Kirkley Street, next door to the Fighting Cocks. I think there's a date of about 1760 over the door. This is White House Farm. That's now, I've just forgotten the name of what's there. Bear with me one moment. That's Hildersley Court. You can see Hildersley Court from there today, the sheltered accommodation. And you can see also from other maps, the only buildings in Kirkley that predate 1800. If you're familiar with Pakefield Street, if you come out of the Johnny Sailor's pub, turn right, go past the bottom of Wilson Road, and look to your right again, just a few steps in, you'll see to your right, to the north, up behind some very long gardens, this little terrace of cottages. They certainly predate 1800. And as far, with the exception of the church, of course, but that's taken as read, I would assume. With the exception of those, I've not been able to identify any other buildings that are ostensibly older than the year 1800. So we move on to the next slide. So just to sort of give you some idea of the isolation of Kirkley at this time, here is a view from Lowestoft, looking south towards the cliffs of Kirkley and Pakefield and beyond. And this is before the building of the harbour. With a little bit of luck, if I've done this right, we should get a zoom into it. There we are now. You can see with the two-masted brig sailing on the water there, just above that and to the right on the cliff top is Kirkley Church. In front of Kirkley Church again are the few houses of the farm on Carlton Road, and beyond them half hidden because they're on the slope that's leading you down to Kirkley Fen and Kirkley Stream, is the farm and cottages on Kirkley Street. So that's just to give it in some sort of context, and you can see how just today the land shelves off very rapidly in Kirkley and goes down to the very low lying ground, just as it does today, where the seafront, the first esplanade is built, and which was basically a floodplain for Lake Lothing, which explains why even today with extreme high tides, the area around Belvedere Road still floods, because it is basically a floodplain. That's why our ancestors were sensible enough not to enclose it and build on it, because they know every so often it would get flooded. So we push on again to the next slide, please. Okay, the old road. We know for a fact there was an old road. I'm just going to explain. I want you to watch carefully at the map, and you should see the track of the original highway leading south out of Lowestoft. The Turnpike Road didn't exist. It was laid out, as we'll see in a moment, and the roads changed in 1785-86, simply because the old road, the red line there, as you can see, disappears into the sea. It was so close to the low-lying beach at Lowestoft that the records show that every so often when there was a high tide, it was flooded and was impassable. So this new road was cut in 1785. It was known as the London Turnpike, and it was laid out under an Act of Parliament in 1785, 25th of George III, chapter 116. There's a copy of the Act of Parliament that permitted that road to be laid out, and the old road was extinguished and the new road was laid out. It didn't go all the way through to Pakefield as it does today. It came all the way through Lowestoft, right up from where Yarmouth Road is today, as straight as an arrow, straight the way through. Didn't have to worry about a bridge. As you can see from the map, there's still no cut into the sea, all the way down to the top of Pakefield Road. Then you had to go down Pakefield Road into Pakefield Street and down Pakefield Street and head south that way if you wanted to get to Southwold and other towns and villages to the south of Lowestoft, to Kessington and what have you. So if we go to the next slide, please. So this is London Road South, looking due north, as I'm sure many of you will recognise. This is the new Turnpike Road that was built in 1785-86. It was a private road. There would be a toll booth at either end of it, and if you were a stranger, local people didn't have to pay to travel down it, but if you were a stranger, then you had to pay a small toll to travel down this new road. It was privately owned by trustees. It wasn't a public road in that sense. It was called a turnpike, for those of you who know. There was a gate across it, and there were, according to, I think it's a fact, although it might just be a tradition though, there were a row of pikes with sharp points on them on the top of the gate to stop people leaping over them on horseback. Once you paid your toll, they turned the pikes with their points downwards, opened the gate and let you through into the road. That's the received story of why it's called a turnpike, and probably correctly. So we're looking north here. So if in after 1786, really, when the road was complete, the next section you travel down, as I've just explained, was Pakefield Road. So if we go to the next slide, please. So this is a view standing at the southern end of Pakefield Road, looking up towards London Road South, the turnpike. This was the main highway through to get you back again on track to go to Castleland and beyond. So this quite insignificant little road would have been quite a very busy road, even after the building of the turnpike, because traffic was still coming down the old road. It never ceases to amaze me how history changes things. I'm just looking at this photograph that I took about 4 years ago and realised over on the right there how much of all that has changed and become part of the history of the area, with the demolition of the old hotel and the new CFAS buildings and what have you. Perhaps 200 years time somebody will be telling the history of that area. Anyway, if we move on to the next slide, this slide, these facts tend to upset many people. We're now standing at the bottom of Pakefield Road, looking west down Pakefield Street. Pakefield Road, the junction, is where that little doggy's standing by the lamppost. That's the junction of the road. Now, the parish boundary between Kirkley and Pakefield anciently went down the ecclesiastical boundary. Historically, even at this time, went down the centre of Pakefield Street. So if you lived on the south side of Pakefield Street, you could all honestly, with your hand on your heart, say, I live in Pakefield. But if you lived on the north side of Pakefield Street, you couldn't claim to be living in Pakefield. You were actually living in Kirkley. That upsets lots of people. All of the buildings on this photograph have long since, in the late 18th, early 19th century, been washed away. I'm just having a quick look at my map. If you see it on the Kirkley side, in the middle distance, there's a gable end of a building with a little shed in front of it. That's where the Jolly Sailors pub is today. So you can see how much of everything has disappeared. The shop on the corner, in actual fact, it's not a shop. That's the Cliff Hotel, which eventually fell down the cliff. I don't know the name of the dog. Another interesting aside here. Another interesting aside here. Pakefield, in 1854, as hopefully we'll see in a moment, Pakefield was incorporated into Lowestoft. We'll come to that in a moment. And it stayed a part of and remained a part of Lowestoft for administrative purposes. Pakefield refused to be part of the town of Lowestoft. So the parish boundary down Kirkley Street was the extent of Lowestoft's jurisdiction. It didn't go over the road. And if you look at the map, you've got a perfect example of that. Next time you go down Pakefield Street, have a look. If you look at this map, you'll notice two things. Well, you notice lots of things, but the two things I'd like to point out to you is, A, there's a lovely wide raised footpath on the Kirkley side of Pakefield Street. There is no footpath on the Pakefield side of the street. There's a nice gas lamp on the Kirkley side of the street, but there's no lamps on the Pakefield side of the street. It's because Lowestoft, the improvement commissioners, which I'll mention in a moment, later the borough of Lowestoft until the 1930s, were not responsible for looking after the south side of Pakefield Street. So that's why even today, when you come up by the Trowel and Hammer, you'll notice there are no pavements and what have you, because until the 1930s, the burghers of Lowestoft were only looking after the north side of Pakefield Street, the Kirkley side, and not the Pakefield side. So we'll move on to the next slide. So this is the important changes that are going to happen. The private landowners in Carlton Colville, Alton and Kirkley, and if you can look at the Act of Parliament, if you can read it on your screen there, you'll see 1, 2, 3, 4 lines down in italics for the introduction. You'll see it says Kirkley, otherwise Kirkley. So when they drew up the Act of Parliament, they obviously were making sure they ticked all the boxes. So they gave it both names, just in case if they only put one, somebody would say, hang on a minute, that's wrong. It's called Kirkley, not Kirkley. So they put both names there. This is a private Act of Parliament raised by local landowners in Carlton, Colville, Alton and Kirkley, otherwise Kirkley. 1801, the 41st year of the reign of George III, in 1801, and it permitted the enclosure of all the common lands in those 3 parishes, and they were very extensive. Now, we go to the next slide. This is going to need a little bit of explanation. So here's a map that shows from the enclosure award, which shows Lake Lothing. The North Sea is down at the bottom right hand corner. You can see Mill Road and Kirkley Mill that stood at the end of it. But there seems to have been a dispute over where the parish boundaries were. If you look at the green line that runs from left to right, basically from west to east, that's the perambulation way. That's the way. That's the parish boundary between Carlton, Colville and Kirkley and Lowestoft. But if you look at the line that runs up from the bottom, the yellowish colour line, that's the parish boundary that Kirkley says exists. And so there is a dispute. Obviously, I've never seen a written record of it, but there are 2 parish boundaries that are both claimed. And it looks as if Lowestoft is claiming it's got a parish on some of the land in Carlton, Colville on the south side of Lake Lothing. So when they closed the commons, they sorted the commissioners that were appointed by Parliament sorted the problem out. They put the parish boundary between Carlton, Colville and Kirkley down the middle of Lake Lothing, as you can see. And then because Lowestoft had lost some of the land south of Lake Lothing, they gave Lowestoft a chunk of land to the north of Kirkley. They took it from Kirkley and included it into Lowestoft. That means Kirkley have lost a lump of land. So because Carlton Colville has now gained the land that once was Lowestoft's, they've got more land than they had. So they moved the Kirkley parish boundary westwards in a nice straight line away from the Kirkley stream, the Kirkley Ham, and allocate that land to Kirkley. So you can see under the 1801 Act of Parliament, there were some very, very extensive changes made to the ancient parish boundaries, and those are still reflected today. And it's also interesting to note that after the enclosure, it was all concluded. It took 2 years to put it all together. After the enclosure, the parish boundary between Lowestoft and Kirkley ran down what's now Mill Road, and then northwest into Lake Lothing. So that's the changes of the parish boundary. How did they divide the land up? Well, if you go to the next slide, hopefully we can see. So this is my hypothetical, this is my map that I've drawn showing the north end of Kirkley and the south end of Lowestoft. You can see the old parish boundary there, heading along them, and this is the new layout. Now, some of the common land, all the green areas that you see in these maps are common land that don't belong to anybody, but are managed by the Lord of the Manor. That he's part of his domain. You can see that by the early, before the 1800s, some of this pink land in Lowestoft, before they changed the parish boundary, this is where it's very frustrating because I can't use a pointer so I can point out what I'm talking about. But you can see some of the lands actually in the ancient parish of Lowestoft had been common land, and they were enclosed, and the lands were let to farmers and what have you. They were let, and the income was used to improve the lighting and the lamps in the town of Lowestoft. They became known as the lamp lands. If you look immediately above the parish boundary between Kirkley and Lowestoft and see the pink area there, that's the area that basically was nicked from, or exchanged is a better word, with Lowestoft, that was anciently part of Kirkley. Was also after 1803, when the land was enclosed. Those are the lands that were also incorporated into the lamp lands as well, to raise even more money for the town of Lowestoft, to improve the lighting and the sewers and everything in the town. So that's the lamp lands. A little bit more about the lamp lands. You're going to have to bear with me as a Kirkley man. The bit that they put into Lowestoft, as far as this talk goes, is part of the ancient parish of Kirkley. So I will include this area in the talk as well. I'm not going to knock it out of the equation simply because in modern times, and it literally is modern times, it was transferred to Lowestoft. So we're looking at ancient Kirkley. In a way as well, in modern times, on the 1972 Local Government Act, when the area from Hopton upwards was actually moved into Norfolk. Historically, as far as I'm concerned, when I go across this modern Norfolk boundary, Suffolk-Norfolk boundary at Hopton, I remain historically in Suffolk. It's not until I cross the Southtown Bridge that I actually get into Norfolk. I don't argue with the fact administratively that Hopton is part of Great Yarmouth, which is part of Norfolk. But so just an explanation, I'm going to continue including this little area of land that was originally in Kirkley. I'm sorry, I've just been attacked by a moth. That's gone. Somebody must have opened my wallet. Okay, right, so that's the explanation of that. And you see in a moment why I've included the lamp land. So let's move on to the next slide. So this is the common lands before enclosure. And if this system is working right, we'll see the green lines appear in a moment from the original enclosure map. I've redrawn this one. All of the green lines show you how the common land was divided up and allocated to local landowners. The more land you owned, the more you got under the enclosure. If you happen to be a person that owned no land, all you lost was your right to certain liberties on the enclosed land. So you can see here, I've just put on the map, again, I've marked out what would become Belvedere Road. That's the line of the original Lowestoft Kirkley parish boundary. And you can see below that the Windmill and Mill Road that becomes the modern parish boundary. Now, when they enclosed the common land, that up until they enclosed the common land, if you lived in Kirkley, you had a right to cross the common land and go down to the seaside, to the beach. Once they enclosed all the common land, as you can see they've done here, it became private property. So you lost your right to go to the beach, but it was an ancient right. And so what modern day Claremont Road was laid out as a public road to take you through the enclosed common lands, the now privately owned lands, and enabled you to go down to the seashore, which remained common. So that's why that. And if you look in the Lowestoft bit north of Belvedere Road, north of Mill Road, where the windmill is. And if you look across to the northeast up towards the arrow of Belvedere Road, you can see the common land there wasn't enclosed. So Lowestoft people could still get to the water by going across the common land. But in Kirkley, the revised Kirkley, every piece of common land is now private. And so they lay out a road so that people can still cross the old ex-common land and go down to the beach. Right, if we move to the next, before we go on, the road to the left there is what today is or remains of Bird's Lane or Bird's Luke. Again, it's a way to get from Kirkley Run to the enclosed common land there. And basically that still follows the ancient parish boundary. The new parish boundary, as you can see, is further to the west. All right, now we'll move on to the next slide. Of course, one of the biggest changes that would affect Kirkley, but Lowestoft more than that, was the Act of Parliament of 28th of May 1827, which permitted a cut to be made through the Lamplands. We're looking here at Kirkley, basically. You can see down the bottom right-hand corner the new harbour, opened in 1832, part of the Norwich Lowestoft navigation. That's a completely different story, one that perhaps I could tell you at some point in the future. But we've now got a cut into the sea. And if you look at the straight turnpike road where it crosses the harbour, you can see to make the bridge across the narrowest part of the cut, the new cut, they had to kink the wood a little bit slightly. That's even what, so today when you cross the bridge, even the Bascule Bridge, when you come at the bottom by the railway station, there's a slight kink in the road and another little kink in the road by Bear Terrace. That's because they spoilt the line of the dead straight turnpike road. Pakefield Street, you can see again, if you cross the bridge at Lowestoft, the new bridge at Lowestoft, go down the turnpike road, you can see the church on your right. You can see Carlton Road going across to Kirkley Run, heading northwards, and then you can go down to Pakefield Road as would be top of Pakefield Street, then out onto the road to Kessingland. I put a red circle round the little cluster of houses near what today is Claremont Road. This map is 1832, and you can see the commons were enclosed. This would all have been common land, if you remember from the maps, enclosed in 1803. By 1832, 29 years later, people have started to build houses and shops and even a pub there. So it didn't take many years before the work probably started in the early 1820s on some of these houses, judging by the deeds of the buildings. There you can see Kirkley Mill and Mill Road again. And another windmill has also been built now on the enclosed common lands. Excuse me while I have a drink. So if we move on to the next bit. So land ownership. This is 1841, based on the 1841 tithe map. The first thing you can see in 1841, they extended, by then they had extended the turnpike road southwards to the bottom of Pakefield Street. So no longer did you have to travel down Pakefield Road and Pakefield Street by 1841. You could now go straight through. I've not been able to find a date when that road was extended, but the interesting thing is that if you look at the 1841 tithe map, and look at land ownership, I hope you can see them nicely coloured on there. The bulk of the land in Kirkley, all the enclosures have got, all the common land is gone. It's all in enclosed land. Most of it is in the hands of a few individuals. There's a huge estate bordering on Pakefield, which is owned by Frances Elizabeth Acton. That's where, those who are familiar with that area, that's where the name Acton Road comes from. There's George C. Gowan, who's another wealthy merchant. He actually lives in Lowestoft. He owns a chunk of land. There's a few bits of land belong to the church. William Everett owns a huge tracts of land. Robert Nietzsche's got a fair bit. John Bird, who gives his name to Bird's Lane, Bird's Loke, he's got a fair bit of land to the west of the parish. And extreme north, actually across the border into Lowestoft, those lands, the lamp lands, belong to Lowestoft town. And the two pieces of land, including what today Windsor Road is, they were put in trust through a body of people called the Kirkley Poors Trust. As I said earlier, a lot of the Kirkley people, the poor people, lost their right for certain things. One of the right was to cut reeds off the common land, to dig peat, to burn on the fire, and they lost the right to do that. So they lost some of their privileges under the old common, when the old commons were there. And so this trust was set up, and these few acres of land, these two large fields, were allocated to the Kirkley Poors, as it was called, usually chaired by the rector of the parish. And the income was applied to buy, to help the poor of Kirkley. The same thing was done in Carlton Colville, the same thing was done in Alton, because all the lands were enclosed at the same time. And the Kirkley Poors Trust, again, that's a separate story. As far as I'm aware, just like Carlton and Alton, the trustees set up under that 1801 Act of Parliament still exist and have lands there. But again, that's a different story. I don't want to get sidetracked into that one tonight. So we'll move on quickly to the next slide. So that was 1841. So we get rid of the colours. Now we go to the map of 1854. And suddenly everything has changed. If you look into the northwest corner of the map, up in Kirkley and across the border into the bit of Kirkley that's now Lowestoft, you can see that the buildings have taken place. The most important thing, of course, is Samuel Morton Peto, who's responsible for bringing the railway, etc., has laid out the esplanade in Lowestoft. And each end, as there is today, of his original esplanade, it was 450 yards long, and it was, I've got the actual numbers here again, I've forgotten off the top of my, 450 yards long, 20 feet wide, and built beside it were 7 double-fronted, very high-quality houses. The double-fronted, it says 7 double-fronted houses there, 14 in total. A hotel, the Royal Hotel. Behind them, we'll come to them in a moment, is Marine Terrace, Marine Parade, as it was known as. And of course, as the town is slowly growing now, a new church has been built, opened in 1852. This is St. John's Church, which is now gone. That was built at the same time. The two statues of Triton that you see there were actually designed by this sculptor and architect, John Thomas, who was responsible for basically rebuilding Somerleyton Hall for Samuel Wharton Peter when he lived there. He was actually produced them. John Thomas was one of the architects responsible for rebuilding the Houses of Parliament after they were burnt to the ground in the 1830s. And Samuel Wharton Peter, who actually got the contract to do a lot of the building work, he became friends with John Thomas, one of his architects, and Thomas came to Lowestoft, and Peter commissioned him to have these two somewhat now weather-worn statues at each end of his splendid promenade. So if we move on to the next slide. So I said earlier, before we look at the seafront, in 1854, an Act of Parliament was passed, the Lowestoft Improvement Act, which allowed a body of basically an embryonic town council to be formed, to be elected by ratepayers. They consolidated all the management of the various organisations into one body. This body were authorised to collect rates, to manage the town, more or less the same way as it would be managed by an incorporated borough. And this is when it Kirkley first becomes known as South Lowestoft. And the little bit that I've highlighted in red there, in actual says the South Ward. The town was divided into 3 wards. The East Ward, the West Ward, and the South Ward, for election purposes. As I say, they're now electing the people running the town and not being appointed anymore. And it says here, the South Ward shall comprise of such part of the town and parish of Lowestoft as lies south of the harbour and Lake Lothing, and the whole of the said parish of Kirkley, otherwise Kirkley. We're still going down that path, and coloured yellow. I've never seen the plan. In the plan heretofore referred to. So for the first time, Kirkley ceases to run its own business. It's now become part of Lowestoft, and it's more and more referred to, especially for administrative purposes, as South Lowestoft rather than Kirkley. So we push on. Next slide, please. So let's go back to Peter's seafront and have a look there. Here, the big hotel, the Royal Hotel, opened in July 1849. This stuff went up pretty quick, judging by the newspaper reports. There was nothing there. This was just common land that belonged to Samuel Wharton Peter, was Lord of the Manor. This was the bits of common land that had once been part of Kirkley, but were now part of Lowestoft. That's where he built his esplanade, the big houses, and the hotel. And here's a very early picture of the hotel. This is dated June 20, 1850. So it's basically a year after the hotel was erected. And this is a view from the South Pier. If we move on to the next slide, please. And here's a contemporary view looking up the esplanade. You can see Triton. This is from the Royal Plain end, from the South Pier end, looking due south. And you can see in the foreground, well, more or less in the foreground, Triton. And my slide has changed too quick. You could also see the one in the distance. Here's a later photograph of it. Within 5 years of the hotel being built, an extra floor was added to it. So here's, and the builders who did all this work were these two gentlemen, Charles and Thomas Lucas. They had a huge builder's yard along roughly where Asda is today. Their main yard, because they worked all over the country, was in London, and it was called the Belvedere, and that's why you get Belvedere Road as you move. Today's name, Belvedere Road, after the name of their works in London. Here's the grand entrance to the Royal Hotel. The Royal Coat of Arms were over the doorway, lining the unicorn, and the lion itself is still in existence. It's nowhere near the hotel. It's actually on a gatepost at the bottom of St. John's Road, behind the cinema there, looking very sad for itself. But that's, as far as I know, the last vestiges of the old Royal Hotel, and it still sits there, quietly forgotten at the bottom end of St. John's Road. We push on. And here's another view, a closer view of those wonderful first-class lodging houses that were built, 7 pairs of them along the esplanade, and they were built as lodging houses for the great and the good who would come to Lowestoft. And of course, here's the last 2 of them. The rest have all gone. Flying 15s and the other little fish and chip shop, the other novelty sweet shops and what have you. These are the last 2 of the original Peto buildings that were built by the Lucas brothers, who put up a tremendous amount, did a tremendous amount of the building work in Lowestoft. All of this is Peto's brainchild. He did finance it. He did provide the land for a lot of these places to be built. Again, I'm not going to go down the history of the Esplanade. That's another talk. So we push on to the next slide. Just before we leave there, again, I couldn't resist putting this one in. Again, it's actually in Lowestoft, but it's actually within the ancient parish of Kirkley. This is the first South Pier that was built. You can see the reading rooms at the end, halfway along the pier. You actually had to be a subscriber to go on the pier. So that's the very, very early South Pier as well, which is technically inside the ecclesiastical parish of Kirkley. But by this time, that area, as we found out, has been subsumed by Lowestoft. So I thought I'd just bung that one in out of interest. The yacht basin doesn't even have a quay. There's only a beach there at this time. It's changed just a tad. We push on again to the next slide. So this is Marine Parade. These were said to be, there's 50 of them, went up in the early 1850s. They were completed by 1853. These were classed as second-rate houses. The first-rate houses were the ones on the Esplanade. And here today, the terrace is still extant in exactly the same as it was back in the day. Probably looking slightly careworn compared with when it originally went up. But these are the really first buildings to go up in this area. Once again, you could argue that after they moved the parish boundary southwards in 1801, that these are technically part of Lowestoft. But again, I'm still focusing on the ancient ecclesiastical parish of Kirkley. So that's why I've included stuff that is technically at this point in Lowestoft. Okay, so that's Marine Terrace and Marine Terrace, Marine Parade. And so we go to the next slide. Now, this is Samuel Morton Peter, who is responsible for all this, but there's one man I've kind of really developed a great affection for. It's this man, John Louth Clements. John Louth Clements was a Londoner. He moved up to Lowestoft in the 1840s. he was Peter's principal architect. And Peter, by the 1860s, had disappeared and hardly ever came back to Lowestoft. John Life Clemens settled here and became one of the leading figures in the life of this town. Again, he's another subject, and he's Peter's principal architect. Most of the buildings that went up for Peter were designed by this man. The Royal Hotel were, the lodging houses, Marine Parade, and lots of other buildings long after Peter left continued to be designed by this gentleman here. And in 1886, he actually became the mayor of the borough of Lowestoft after it was formed. He was held with great respect in the town. So I bring him into my talk because he lived at number 14 Marine Parade. He lived there all his life. He designed the terrace. He moved in as soon as it was finished, and he died at number 14 in 1911. And he lived there all his life. Again, he's the subject of another talk that I give. I'm just looking at my watch and thinking it's going to be time to truncate this talk and finish it next time. Just find a nice cut-off point. Okay, this could be the nice cut-off point. Okay, you remember the 1832 map where we saw there was a little group of houses that already sprung up in the town on the new Turnpike Road. These are some of the very earliest cottages that were built. Well, they were more than cottages. And also on the other side of the road, these buildings here, they weren't one continuous terrace. These all date from probably the 1840s. Then there's film in that makes them into terraces. Okay, right. I see we've gone back to that one. Let me go back to that one as well, because I want to have say something about that. Those as well, you can see they've got single-story shops in front of them today, but the houses are actually set back from the road. Those single-story shops, in actual fact, were front gardens. When these houses went up, they were basically built overlooking the sea to the front and the open fields to the back. You mustn't see them as part of continuous building line that we have today. These are quite isolated, almost rural, nice cottages on the new Turnpike Road. And if we move up beyond this one, as I said, these houses here that you can see, these are also very early. These date from the 1840s probably. They weren't built as a continuous thing. They've been infilled in the way, but there were smaller cottages on the east side of the Turnpike Road as well. These on the corner of Waterloo Road, as you can see. We go on to the next slide. Here are some more of the cottages that you can see. Again, set back from the road, quite small, further up. I'm sure some of these are familiar to you. And again, the front gardens have been built over. As the town expanded in the late Victorian period, there was more and more call for shops, and many people built single-story extensions over their front gardens. So again, these predate all the buildings around them. And if we move further up again, fortunately, and may it stay that way, there's another pair of cottages, again, far later, far earlier than anything round them. We know from them that the little front gardens, they're basically on the side of the road. Their backs overlooking open farmland. So again, it's hard to visualize. Just imagine some of the villages that you see when you go around some of the highways and byways of Suffolk, where there's just little clumps of houses in the field. This is the same thing that we've got here, even as late as the 1850s. Right, I've got 2 more to do, and then we're going to have a break because I need to rest my voice. I'm sure somebody's saying thank God for that. If we go to the next slide. 1851, there's already a pub, and we've identified it as being this place, the Plough and Sale, and it's built round about the time these very early buildings went up. Whenever there's people, there's going to be a pub, that's a sure thing. And the Plough and Sale, 1851, the census, it's definitely there in 1851. William Bond is the landlord. Across the road from there, kind of hidden behind the houses that now line the main road, were this strange little terrace. Again, these are very early, Union Place and Orchard Terrace. There seems to have been no overall plan in Kirkley for laying it out in some sort of pattern. Here we've got somebody had just decided to build these 2 little rows of cottages. The ones in Union Place are a little bit smaller than the ones that you can't see facing them on Orchard Terrace. So these places are, they never actually become proper roads. They never join up to anything as such. They don't form part of the overall pattern. They sit there in wonderful isolation behind the Turnpike Road, behind London Road South. Ladies and gents, it's approaching 9 o'clock. At this point, I am actually going to stop and continue next week if we're all able to come along. Oh, hi, I'm back again.
Hello.
That
Ivan.
went up longer than I intended, but I hope that was it.
Well, it certainly wasn't too long for any of us. There's been some very, very appreciative comments and a couple of questions. Have you got time for me to ask a couple of questions on behalf of our viewers?
I'm not going anywhere.
No.
Yeah, of
okay.
course I will.
I've actually got a couple myself, if you don't mind, Ivan. Going back to the turn when the London Road South was the Turnpike.
Yeah.
You mentioned it was sort of maintained by the trustees, and the toll was paid by strangers. I just wondered, where would that money that was collected go? Would it go back into the upkeep of the road?
Yes. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Hopefully making a profit as well.
Yeah, of course.
Because these 2 are part of a great big plan. They're very complex. The Act of Parliament that established the Turnpike Road wasn't just between, it was the Yarmouth Ipswich Turnpike, eventually leading you to London.
Right.
And it wasn't built in, so it's in sections, but it's part of a much bigger plan. That's just one section of this overall plan. The history of the turnpikes is a really complex subject. I sound as if I'm trying to hedge my bets here as to what to say, but yeah, the trustees had to apply for the Act of Parliament. I think the Act of Parliament, and I've seen a copy of it, I think the Act of Parliament, we saw the front cover of it there, the Act of Parliament, I think, runs to 75 pages of conditions and do's and don'ts and can'ts and wills and won'ts and what have you. We don't know, there was definitely a toll booth at the top of where Old Nelson Street in Lowestoft, because you've got to imagine this being one continuous road running from the bottom of the High Street in Lowestoft, because the High Street is not part of the turnpike, all the way straight the way through to the top of St Peter's Road Pakefield Road. You've got to see that as one single entity, not a bit in Lowestoft and a bit in that's almost like a piece of narrow strip of private land, and you need to to travel over it. The idea is if you can give people much better access rather than going as they had before it was built in Lowestoft, down Old Nelson Street and along by Battery Green Road, which was actually the beach at that time, which kept getting washed away, at times impassable. If you can, just as you can today, for the sake of commerce, if you can provide a much more direct, easy and accessible route from A to B, people will, there's only a few pence to go through. Soldiers were exempt from it, local people were exempt from it, but so what they're doing is catching the through traffic, if you like. And
Much
then
like
once you got to the north of Lowestoft, up by roughly by Bellevue Park, the turnpike started again and went through along what's now the A47 to Great Yarmouth. Okay, and you said there's some more queries?
There is. I'm going to predicate them with a couple of comments, and then I'll go into the question. So, Chris Collins got very excited when you mentioned Vikings, but we won't go into that because I don't know what the context is. Maggie Clark, she said, I was born and bred in Kirkley. I lived at the bottom of Kirkley Run. Our garden ran down to Kirkley Stream. My mum and dad lived there all their married life. And Rosemary Bokett, she says, I grew up in Kirkley too. Lived in Cleveland Road, backing onto Mill Road. Now, the reason I've singled those comments out is because they lead on to a couple of questions whereby we're bringing in a little bit of competition between Kirkley and Pakefield and Kessingland. Because Carly Franklin, she said, I would love to know if Ivan knows why a road in Kessingland near Livingston is called Black Street. Would love to know more about Kessingland before I was born. I've lived here all my life. Now, everybody is really enjoying the Kirkley subject, so I don't want you to think they all want you to move on to Kessingland by any means.
No, there are probably people in Kessingland who are far more competent to talk about the history of that town, village, than I am. I did have relatives who lived in Kessingland, so I'm very familiar with the town. I've done a little bit of sort of background research, but yeah, Black Street is quite interesting. I don't know why it's called Black Street, but it's for a reason. There's most things in this world, in fact, everything in this world, there is a reason for it. It's just a question of who we can peel back the layers of history and find out that reason. I mean, my story about the Black Heath, there is no historical record to support that. It's just a common tradition, with basically going to the old tenant, there's no smoke without a fire somewhere. So there might be, this might be almost a common memory of something that was passed down. And I think I've been very interested in oral traditions, how things are passed down. And again, I've gone off a tangent probably here, but my grandparents, Bunn, lived out at Carlton Colville before it was a sprawling housing estate, and they lived in a little cottage. I wouldn't go into the details. My grandmother, Bunn, couldn't read nor write. And one day when I went to see her, when I was in my early teens, I cycled out to see her. She got out of her chair and she rubbed her legs and she said, "My God, my legs feel like sere twigs." And I thought, what about it? So I asked my mother, what did grandmother, all my mother said, because she didn't get on with her mother-in-law, she's just a silly old fool. So I didn't get there. Many, many years later, when I got interested in language, I found that sere is a pure Anglo-Saxon word for dry. So my grandmother in the 1950s used the pure Anglo-Saxon words. Now, she can't read or write. She'd never been to school. She'd used an Anglo-Saxon word, sere, to describe how her dry legs felt.
Well,
had previous generations of females said the same thing and passed that word down from Anglo-Saxon times.
Yeah, and kept it in common parlance. It's
In common parlance, yeah. Anyway, that's a side on that one.
No, that's
But
fascinating.
yeah.
Also, well, just to say, when you mentioned there's no smoke without fire, could that be the reason for Blackheath?
Yeah, there might just have been a big fire there.
Yeah.
There is another up in Alton, on Alton Street, on the opposite side of the road, going down from Meadow Road. There's some fields there quite early on that are called the Black Fields.
Mm-hmm.
Now, black might just be telling you the colour of the soil for some reason.
Yeah.
You know, I mustn't read too much into it. It's just the fact that the area known as the Blackheath, for some reason, was never cultivated. It was left empty and common to people, as if for some reason, again, you've got the makings of a good novel here.
Yeah, absolutely.
You want, yeah. So again, it's supposition, but I think there's more to history than just hard facts. History is made up of people and events that often get unrecorded but are remembered and passed down. So I think in the tapestry of history, it's very important. I'm talking all these things. I was saying the tapestry of history, I think it should also weave these oral traditions into that tapestry as well, because they are all part and parcel of the people and the life and the events that make up the world today.
Yeah, I agree, and I think part of the problem is that people don't see themselves as interesting. They feel they're unremarkable. Their story is common, or kind of boring somehow. But I think that we all feel that because we've lived our lives, so we know exactly what it entails. Whereas somebody else who hasn't, but they'd be very interested to hear our story. And I think that's exactly why you're so right, that these living histories need to be recorded while we're still living them.
No, definitely. Yeah.
Just a couple of quick more comments. One from Maggie Clark. She says, "This is bringing back so many childhood memories. I've lived in Carlton Colville 44 years, but my heart still belongs to Kirkley."
Good old Kirkley girl.
Hey, and Keith Clark says, "A very interesting session. 1 thumb up." Rosemary says, "Thank you, Ivan. Fascinating." And Chris Collins says, "Brilliantly fascinating." She's given it 6 rounds of applause, and I think that must be a record for any of our broadcasts. Jerry Paul says, "Amazing as always." And Carly Franklin says, "Very interesting. Loved tonight." Linda Boyce says, "Thank you, Ivan. So interesting." Jackie Draper says, "Lovely evening, learnt so much." I know you're blushing with this, but I want you to know how much everyone appreciated it. And Ben's also said, "Very interesting. Thank you, Ivan." And we've had a special comment. I wonder if you might know this young lady called Emma Jane. She says, "My dad, he's such an interesting and amazing man. Proud of him. Love, heart."
Thank you, Emma.
You'll pay her later. So I think that almost rounds us off. I just need to I need to thank everybody that's been viewing tonight, and especially those people that have commented, because as Ivan said right at the beginning, it really helps us to know that, one, that there's people out there, and two, it helps us to know how you're engaging with us and what you find the most interesting out of all the interesting things that Ivan mentioned tonight. Don't forget that the next broadcast we make for our history sessions on next Monday will be a continuation of this. Is that right, Ivan?
That's correct. Yep. Yeah. There's probably about the same amount to come again, but coming much more into the nearer the present day, with places that you'll be a lot more familiar with. It's particularly if you're a Kirkley like me. But can I just say, well, thanks for everybody for tuning in and sort of supporting this. I'm enjoying it. I've said before, I do find it a bit strange sitting here in my lounge without an audience, talking to a little box. I'm getting quite used to it now. It's a lot different because you can't see your audience and react to them. And I've been doing public talks and lectures for over 40 years now, but it's all part of the learning curve, and I am enjoying it. And I just thank Paul and Stephen for inviting me along to do this. I think it's kept me a little bit sane during this strange period that we've gone through.
Yeah, well, you're certainly a master of it, whether it's on screen or as you said, whites of their eyes gigs. But hopefully, if you'd be up for it, Ivan, perhaps the Voice Cloud or Stephen and I can soon put you back in front of actual people, because these have been great. But we can continue it with a real life audience as soon as it's safe and responsible to do so.
Yeah. There has been suggestions as well, because I do a lot of them. Now that I've retired from Suffolk County Council and the Lowestoft Record Office since January, one thing I'm thinking might be a good idea. I'd like to walk, and I've been doing under the auspices of the Suffolk County Council and the Lowestoft Record Office, historical walks around Lowestoft. I really enjoy them because it's feet on the ground and what have you. So there might be a way, once everything goes back to hopefully normality, perhaps we could organise a few of those as well. I'd really love to do them.
Well, you took the words right out of our mouths, actually, because Stephen and I were talking about exactly that. And I wonder if perhaps, I'm sure everybody out there would be really interested in that. If you could register your interest by just leaving a comment to say whether you'd be one of our people to come along and walk with Ivan, we'd really like to know, so we can sort of cater for that and plan for it in the long run. One more thing I will say, Ivan, if you don't mind, is this whole thing, as with our Tuesday night shanty sessions, which I can only just say because I'm not in any way drunk, these are completely supported through the good people of People's Health Trust, and we're very grateful to them and for their support, and for enabling us to continue to engage with our regular rogues, and also a whole new audience that has sprung up from our Facebook broadcasts and now on YouTube as well. But there is another way you can support, specifically Ivan, because Ivan, you've got some published books out there, I believe, and we're gonna put up the dust jackets now so that people can see what it is they need to go out and buy in their droves. So that's a great way that you can support Ivan and learn more about the fascinating subjects within those books. But really, we just, at the moment, we are really loving the fact that you're getting in touch, that you're viewing with us, that you're engaging and putting comments on. Any shares that you can click will be really, really helpful to us. And don't forget that next week will be the continuation of this. As Ivan said, we'll be bringing Kirkley kicking and screaming back into the present day, from where we left off tonight. Now, there's been an awful lot of comments immediately to the walks. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 or 6 comments already, Ivan. So I think we've got a captive market.
Good. Let's hope then that things get back to a semblance of normality and we can actually all meet up, go on walks, and yeah, that'd be good. Again, thanks for inviting me. I've really enjoyed doing this. I'm losing my voice now, so I'm gonna shut up in a minute and go and have a glass of beer.
Okay,
anyway,
my man.
Thank you, Paul.
You're welcome. Good night.
And thanks everybody for tuning in.